Evaluating magic cards can be a tricky thing. Even the most experienced players can't always look at a card and figure out whether or not it's going to be good. This is because Magic is an incredibly complex game, and without playing with cards, it can be difficult to figure out how powerful the effects they have actually are. One of the most notable examples of this is Umezawa's Jayemdae. When it was first revealed in 2005, most players thought it wasn't very good. After all, it's an equipment that doesn't actually do anything until a creature does combat damage. But once people started actually playing with the card, they realized it was incredibly easy for it to accumulate charge counters, and the fact it could act as a removal spell, combat trick, and life gain all at the same time made it incredibly strong. As did the fact that it didn't even need to be equipped to something to remove charge counters for value. In the end, the Jayemdae became one of the most powerful equipments ever printed, and it dominated multiple formats, and still sees some play in Legacy even today. So evaluating how good a card is going to be is tough, but I think it can also be quite difficult to look at older Magic cards and figure out how good they used to be. This is because if you don't know the metagame and the power level of the cards in their original context, you aren't really going to understand the card. I've done a few videos now taking a look at 10 cards that used to be really good, even though they aren't very impressive to today's Magic players, and there are tons of other cards in this category. So in this MTG Top 10, I'm going to look at 10 more cards that look terrible to today's players, but were once so good, they were very successful in competitive Magic. While most of my top 10s are ranked lists, that's not really the case here, because this list is super subjective. These are just 10 cards that look bad today, but used to be great, in no particular order. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want Magic singles or sealed product, use my link in the description. First, let's look at Galina's Knight. For a white and a blue, it's a 2/2 with protection from red. By today's standards, that's not remotely impressive, of course, and while you're probably aware of creature power creep being a thing, this still mostly looks like it would have been a sideboard card back in the day, right? I mean, it's kind of hard to cast for Grizzly Bear stats and has a very situational form of protection that's entirely useless against many opponents. And yeah, even back in the early 2000s, this card wasn't really viewed as good, at least not until Zvi Mowshowitz put together a very peculiar deck that won Pro Tour Tokyo in 2001. The format was invasion block constructed, and it was utterly dominated by red, largely because of the fearsome Flametongue Kavu, which warped the entire format. A 4-mana 4/2 that could kill almost anything when it entered was an absurd card, and as I've said in the past, this card would still be reasonably good even in today's standard format, since it generates a 2-for-1 immediately and leaves behind a body that your opponent has to account for in one way or another, since it has pretty high power. The Kavu was so good that it came to dominate pretty much all of Magic's formats in the early 2000s, not just Invasion Block Constructed, where it was easily the most powerful card in the format. However, the Kavu does have one big weakness. It isn't designed the same way creatures with enters triggers are these days. Instead of saying it can deal 4 damage to up to one creature, or that you may have it do damage, Flametongue Kavu has to do 4 damage to something, whether you want it to or not, and that's where Galina's Knight comes in. Zvi Mowshowitz's response to this Flametongue Kavu-dominated format was a deck he called The Solution, and almost every creature in the deck had protection from red. So that when the dreaded Kavu showed up, your opponent had to blast one of their own creatures or the Kavu itself with the Enters trigger. This strategy proved to be incredibly good, and completely annihilated the format's best deck that made up a ridiculous share of the metagame, as evidenced by the fact that Zvi won a Pro Tour while sleeving up seemingly unimpressive creatures like Galina's Knight. So it may just look like a super janky sideboard card today, but back in the early 2000s, Galina's Knight was one of the best ways to beat Flametongue Kavu decks. Let's move from one Merfolk to another. This one is Merfolk of the Pearl Trident. For 1 blue mana, it's a 1/1, and that's it. A vanilla 1 mana 1/1 would never see play today, but this one not only saw play, it appeared in a deck that was a runner-up at a World Championship. That deck was a standard Merfolk deck, but these decks weren't exactly packing a ton of payoffs for the creature type compared to what we're used to seeing today. In fact, Lord of Atlantis was the only one. And while the Lord is certainly great, it's difficult for today's players to believe that running only one Merfolk payoff was reason enough to be running such an underwhelming 1-drop. But the Merfolk deck that this Merfolk was part of was very particular. They were Merfolk opposition decks. These decks were 1 part mono blue tempo and 1 part prison decks. Opposition is an enchantment that lets you tap creatures you control to tap down artifacts, creatures, and lands. Once the deck had enough creatures in play, it could get pretty close to time-walking the opponent, tapping down all of their lands every turn. These decks also used Static Orb, an artifact that makes both players able to only untap 2 permanents during their untap step, but that effect was only in force if it was untapped, and that meant you could make sure it would shut down your opponent on their turn, but it wouldn't do the same to you, because you would use your Merfolk to tap down your own orb and have your turn as normal. So, having a 1-drop Merfolk around to tap for opposition was important, not just because it could attack and help you win games, but also because it gave you a cheap body to use alongside that powerful enchantment. You could basically bide your time until you had enough creatures to do lethal, which was made easier by Island Walk plus a stats boost on all of your Merfolk, even the meager ones. Merfolk of the Pearl Trident never makes it into today's Merfolk decks, but there were only so many cheap Merfolk in Standard in 2001, and that led to it seeing play in one of the format's best decks. Let's take a look at another blue creature now, Ophidian. For 2 generic and a blue, it's a 1/3, and when it attacks and isn't blocked, you can draw a card, and if you do, it assigns no combat damage this turn. Creatures who draw you cards when they hit your opponent have a pretty good track record in Magic, as a creature like that can really allow you to push your advantage while also slowly whittling away at your opponent's life total, like Thieving Magpie can, but in most ways the Ophidian is far worse. It may cost less mana, but it doesn't come with built-in evasion, and if you want to draw cards with it, you have to forego doing any damage at all to your opponent. So Ophidian on its own can't really function as a win condition the same way Thieving Magpie can, and it's also a lot worse at getting in. So how did this card ever top 8 a World Championship and other events? Part of it is just a world where 3 mana for a 1/3 was better than it is today. Creature power creep is very real, and back then creatures had worse stats, especially when they came with upside like Ophidian does. But it also saw play in decks that were really good at making sure Ophidian got in turn after turn, at which point it feels pretty close to an enchantment that draws you a card every turn, and that's a great deal for 3 mana. It was first played in blue-red control decks in Standard, which had a pretty hefty helping of burn too. The burn could both be used to get blockers out of the way to get Ophidian to draw you cards, and Ophidian could help you draw more of the aforementioned burn spells to keep you from running out of gas when your opponent's life total was low. And when you're packing Incinerate and Pyrokinesis, you can make up for the Ophidian not actually doing damage in a pretty significant way. These decks also use lots of counter magic to keep the board clear, as well as Mana War to bounce things. So in other words, it was a control deck that was great at controlling the board, and this allowed Ophidian to really shine. Later on, it also saw play in a mono-blue, partially eponymous deck called Forbidian, and the deck's 2 most prominent cards were Ophidian and Forbid, a counterspell with buyback, which would normally be challenging to buy back since it makes you discard cards, but with Ophidian around, you had plenty of extra cards and you could keep getting the counterspell back every time you cast it. These decks were still packing Mana War and lots of counter magic, as well as another good bounce creature, Tradewind Rider, so Ophidian, once again, was a very reliable source of card advantage. Today, this card would have a very challenging time getting in for damage since creatures are so much better, and we also don't generally see quite as efficient of burn or counter magic in Standard, but in the late 1990s, Ophidian was a card drawing engine. Alright, that's enough blue cards. Let's look now at a card that is distinctly not blue, Arc-Slogger. For 3 generic and 2 red mana, it's a 4/5, and you can pay 1 red mana and exile the top 10 cards of your library to have the Slogger do 2 damage to any target. A 5 mana 4/5 is below rate these days and wasn't even all that impressive in 2004, and this activated ability kind of reads like it's a joke. Exiling 10 cards is kind of a crazy cost, and it means there's a limit on how many times you can actually use the ability. But I actually think Arc-Slogger has a really cool design. I mean, if you take away the exile 10 cards part, being able to pay 1 red to do 2 to anything is actually super strong, and this really nerfs it by limiting how many times a player can actually fire it off. And that's good, because this card was actually incredibly good in its original context, and it probably would have been utterly broken without the exile. Even with a cap on how many times you can use it, being able to pick off smaller creatures or finish the opponent off super efficiently is really nice. Most of Arc-Slogger's success came in Mirrored and Block Constructed, which is probably a bit surprising to those of you who weren't playing at the time, as that set is well known for having absolutely busted artifact decks. And indeed, they were a huge part of the metagame, just like Flame Tongue Kavu decks at the Invasion Block Pro Tour, and just like Galina's Knight, Arc-Slogger was part of a deck that was explicitly designed as a counter to the dominant deck in the format. These decks were packing all kinds of artifact hate and burn, and Arc-Slogger's massive size and its activated ability also wreaked havoc on a deck that was highly reliant on keeping Frogmite, Ornithopter, and Disciple of the Vault on the battlefield. And if your opponent wasn't careful, Arc-Slogger can possibly threaten to do 12 damage the turn after it comes down by using the ability 4 times and smashing in for 4. And that's a lot of damage for one card to represent. I'm definitely a fan of Arc-Slogger and think it'd be cool if they designed a few more cards with this kind of exile ability, but if they did it'd probably need to be a more efficient creature as its baseline, as these days, Arc-Slogger is way too clunky. Let's look at another card that has a powerful effect, but it comes at the cost of you exiling cards, Crumbling Sanctuary. For 5 generic mana, it's an artifact, and if damage would be dealt to a player, that player exiles that many cards from the top of their library instead. Yeah, it's symmetrical, and that means your opponent also gets to reap the rewards here, and that's really this card's main problem. After all, shutting down damage for a while is something lots of decks would be happy to do, but at 5 mana, this is definitely underwhelming for a card that doesn't really do anything all on its own, and you're the one who spends mana and a card on this effect, so that's especially problematic that your opponent also gets access to it. And if you're playing an aggro deck and your game plan is to get this down for 5 mana to protect you, there's a good chance you're going to die before you ever get it into play. Basically, this is the kind of card that's only super useful in fairly specific situations, and one that you usually need to get rid of at some point if you want to, actually win the game in one way or another. And the Sanctuary actually saw play in standard and extended decks that were very much capable of both grabbing it for the ideal situation and getting rid of it when they needed to. A singleton copy of the card often appeared in artifact decks that used both Tinker and Goblin Welder. Both of them have you sacrifice an artifact to cheat another artifact into play, and that means that they're both good ways to get the Sanctuary into play early when you need to buy yourself some time, and they are great ways to also get rid of the Sanctuary when you're ready to go for the win by grabbing your win condition, like Phyrexian Colossus, so you could grab it at the perfect time and get rid of it at the perfect time too. It also didn't hurt that these decks could accelerate their mana for artifacts thanks to tons of mana rocks as well as Mana Worker, so even hard casting it was doable. These days, the Sanctuary doesn't really see play anywhere. There are just way better prison artifacts for the decks that want them, and way more absurd things you can cheat into play with Tinker or Goblin Welder. Let's move from one seemingly narrow artifact to another one, Thran Turbine. For 1 generic mana, it's an artifact that gives you 2 colorless mana at the beginning of your upkeep, but you can't spend the mana to cast spells. Certainly one of the most restrictive sources of mana in the game, because it gives you the mana only during your upkeep, which is already quite restrictive since you'll lose the mana if you're not careful. And actually, when this was originally printed, if you couldn't spend the mana, you'd take mana burn damage, so in some ways this was even jankier when it was originally printed. But the fact you also can't even cast spells with it limits things even further. Basically, this is mana you can only use on activated abilities. While that kind of thing might be useful with some very particular commanders, it's hard to imagine that this kind of card would ever work in 60-card formats, right? I mean, it basically does nothing on its own, and what it does do is crazy narrow. Despite those limitations, though, Zvi Mauschwitz, yeah, the same guy with the anti-Flame Tongue Kavu deck a couple years earlier, found a pretty insane way to use the Turbine in Urza's Block Constructed. His deck was called Zero Effect. The deck's primary game plan was to untap Tolarian Academy a whole bunch using Palancron, a creature that untaps 7 lands when it enters, and came with the ability to bounce back to your hand, meaning that you would net mana every time it entered with a powerful land like the Academy being one of the lands that got untapped. This gave you infinite mana, so then you could force your opponent to draw their whole deck with Stroke of Genius. Thran Turbine gave the deck a super cheap artifact to get Academy going, but this deck also used a bunch of cards with cycling to rip through the deck, and back then, cycling was always 2 generic mana, the exact amount of mana that was produced by the Turbine. While Fluctuator was the deck's main way to abuse cycling since it made their cost 0, the Turbine could do it to a lesser extent, and the mana it produced could also be used on stuff like Palancron's activated ability, or to untap Grim Monolith. This event ended up being the only one that Thran Turbine ever top-8'd, as Fluctuator getting banned in Standard made it a lot harder for this deck to go off. But this was once a very important source of extra mana. Let's look at another artifact that looks incredibly underwhelming today, Jayemdae Tome. For 4 generic mana, it's an artifact with an activated ability that costs 4 generic, and you tap it to draw a card. Drawing cards is good and all, but normally, one doesn't want to spend 8 total mana to draw that first card. Like, there's no way that could ever be efficient, right? And yeah, that's true by today's standards. The Tome was even bad 10 years ago in Magic Origins Limited, so it certainly isn't a viable card in constructed formats. But the early days of Magic were quite different. So different that this clunky artifact amassed a World Championship top 8 to go along with 2 Pro Tour top 8s, including a win, and it also appeared in the deck that won German Nationals in 1996. And the first deck it ever saw play in was a precursor to Red Deck wins, which makes even less sense to today's players. However, creatures at the time were way slower. I mean, this deck was running Goblin Balloon Brigade as its primary 1-drop. So even the most aggressive creature decks weren't exactly amazing in 1995, so even red decks ended up in spots where the game was slowing down and you were in top deck mode, and the Tome gave those decks a way to avoid running out of gas. An expensive way to be sure, but it could help you find more lightning bolts and incinerates, which were usually what you needed to finish the game off. In 1996, it started to see play in decks where it makes a little more sense to modern players, a blue-white control deck that drew 1,000,000 cards and used Ivory Tower so it never died. This was a deck that won Pro Tour New York in 2006, and the Tome was one of the many ways the deck could gain absurd card advantage. And at German Nationals, it was played in a prison control deck that used Stormbind as its main win condition. That's a card that could perhaps be in this video in its own right, because I don't think people think it's very good today, but it was a repeatable source of damage, provided you had the cards in your hand to discard to it, and Jayemdae Tome made it so that was never a problem. Eventually, though, there were better ways to draw cards, and games became faster as better aggro creatures, and red especially, were printed, and that put an end to Jayemdae Tome's relevance, to the point that it's not even playable in Limited these days. Next, let's look at Jotun Grunt. For 1 generic and a white, it's a 4/4 with cumulative upkeep. This is a mechanic that is widely panned as being one of the worst mechanics ever. After all, it's mostly downside. If a card has cumulative upkeep, that means you put an age counter on it and then sacrifice it unless you pay its upkeep cost for each age counter on it. In this case, you have to put 2 cards from a single graveyard on the bottom of their owner's library. This means that the first time around, you only have to do exactly that, 2 cards, but then it becomes 4 and 6 and so on. And as soon as you can't do that, you lose this creature, so even though it has great stats, it probably isn't going to have a very long life. In general, I will say I think cumulative upkeep cards are underrated. In fact, enough of them have top 8'd major events for me to make an entire top 10 about the mechanic. But the Grunt is a unique case compared to many of them, because unlike the others, which often demand mana or something, there are situations where Jotun Grunt's trigger is actual upside, and if you can make your 2 mana 4/4's downside into upside, things are going to go pretty well for you. So, how did you turn this into upside? Well, it's true that it's difficult to do for the most part, but there have been a couple of metagames where the Grunt saw significant play. And the situation in all of Magic's formats in 2007 led to it putting up regular top 8s in Standard, Extended, Legacy, and even Vintage. This is because, at the time, graveyard decks were incredibly strong. That's the trick here, using the Grunt's cumulative upkeep to put cards from your opponent's graveyard back on the bottom of their library. Dredge decks powered by Life from the Loam were running rampant. These decks could quickly load the graveyard with the Dredge mechanic, and then generate a ton of value by recurring powerful lands. There were also decks that used Icarid, which you could really easily reanimate multiples of every single turn, but if you're playing something like the Grunt, you can take all those powerful recursive cards away without spending any extra mana at all. And you have a huge creature that can pressure them while simultaneously hating on the graveyard, and hating on the graveyard in a huge way. It was a lot like what Scavenging Ooze is today. These decks are going to have no problem making sure your Grunt has the fuel to stick around, at least until the point where he takes away their entire graveyard, which can definitely happen. But if it does, your opponent definitely isn't winning. Graveyard decks like these were so dominant in multiple formats that the Grunt actually saw lots of main deck play, more main deck than sideboard play, and that alone is enough to tell you that graveyard decks were incredibly prevalent at the time, because in most metagames where there are just some good graveyard decks, main decking the Grunt would be a liability. But it wasn't the case starting in 2007, and the Grunt continued seeing play in multiple formats all the way until 2013. Perhaps its most notable home were decks like Death and Taxes and Hate Bear, both of which were creature decks that ran lots of efficient creatures who were also disruptive, and the Grunt definitely fits the bill there. So, while it's been more than a decade since Jotun Grunt was a viable option as graveyard hate, it did have a fairly long run as a multi-format all-star, and I'm willing to bet that comes as a pretty big surprise to most of you. Let's look at another white creature that looks pretty bad on paper today, Blinking Spirit. For 3 generic and a white, it's a 2/2, and it has an activated ability for 0 mana that lets you return it to your hand. A 4 mana 2/2 is beyond dismal these days, and the benefits of returning a card like this to your hand in today's Magic are limited at best. But this was actually a key card in Ice Age block and standard control decks back in 1996. In addition to the usual fact that a 4 mana 2/2 wasn't quite as bad back then, there are a few important things going on that make the Spirit good. Namely, that activated ability is pretty strong. It can simply block every combat and bounce to its owner's hand, and if your opponent ever tried to remove it, well, you could just bring it back to your hand. Recasting a 4 mana 2/2 over and over again doesn't sound great, but Magic games at the time were far slower, so it wasn't quite as inefficient as it sounds. Basically, the Spirit was the ultimate defensive creature for control decks because it could stick around indefinitely, and many control decks back in the day ran the Spirit as their only creature. There were also a few additional synergies in these decks too. For example, these decks loved Ivory Tower. This was a key card in that era's control decks. It's an artifact that gains you X life at the beginning of your upkeep, where X is the number of cards in your hand minus 4. Control decks already love holding on to lots of cards, and Blinking Spirit could make this card's life gain even more amazing, which generally meant aggro decks had no hope of winning. These decks, of course, also ran board sweepers like Wrath of God, and Blinking Spirit could return to your hand before getting destroyed, and then you could cast it again later. In the aftermath of a Wrath, Blinking Spirit could actually become a pretty real win condition, as a 2/2 on an empty board, while your opponent is in top deck mode, is actually pretty scary for them. Blinking Spirit never saw any play after 1996, but that year it finished in the top 2 at Pro Tour New York, and in second at the Ice Age Block Pro Tour. These decks, it's definitely too inefficient to be viable, but back then, it was one of the most resilient creatures in the game. So bouncing your Blinking Spirit to your hand is free. You know what else is? Subscribing to this channel. I'm trying to reach 100,000 subscribers before the end of the year, and I'd really appreciate your help. Subscribing will help you stay aware of future Magic content, including many more MTG Top 10s. And at number 1, I've got Shivan Dragon. Certainly the most iconic card on the list, the dragon doesn't look very good today. In fact, we recently saw it reprinted in Foundations, and it performed horribly in the limited format according to 17 Lands data, so it wasn't even good in limited. But in Magic's earliest days, this was arguably the game's most imposing creature. For 4 generic and 2 red mana, it's a 5/5 flyer, and you can pay 1 red mana to give it +1/+0 until end of turn. In addition to creature stat lines simply being worse back then, it's also worth remembering that enters or death triggers didn't exist yet. Pretty much all creatures could do was attack and block. This environment is what made Serra Angel the best creature in the game, as she was the only creature at the time with vigilance. She could attack and block every turn cycle, and flying also meant she was tough to stop, and Serra Angel is itself part of what made Shivan Dragon good. With its 5/5 flying body, it was one of the few cards that could both block and attack through an opposing Serra Angel, and while it was 1 mana more expensive, it made up for this by being able to close out games even more quickly than the Angel could thanks to fire breathing. So in the early era of Magic, Shivan Dragon was one of the best finishers around. This resulted in it putting up a top 8 at each of Magic's first major competitive events, the 1994 and 1995 World Championship. So today, it's not even really a playable card in Limited. A very good illustration of how things have changed in Magic over the last 31 plus years, but it was a strong card during the earliest days of competitive Magic the Gathering. So those are 10 bad Magic cards that used to be really good. If you want to own any of them, because maybe you want to relive their heyday, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including more MTG Top 10s on this same topic, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.